Folks, I'm Doug Page, and today I'm honored to be with a radio great and jazz aficionado. I present to you the man with the country's greatest melodic voice, Dick Golden. Dick hosts the American Jazz Show, which can be heard on Saturday mornings on the Real Jazz Channel on SiriusXM Radio. Dick is a man who needs no introduction. His reputation and knowledge of music, especially jazz, precede him. Dick, thank you so very much for being here today.
Well, it's an honor, Doug. Thank you, and congratulations on all your great work.
Well, thank you. Dick, we have a very knowledgeable audience on a lot of different topics, but certainly they're not music experts. Let me ask you a first question here. How did jazz develop?
In America, it was the immigrant experience. I heard something recently where Richard Nixon, when he had Sinatra at the White House as a guest to entertain the president of Italy, he commented in the introduction, it was me insightful and a learning experience, that early in our nation's history, we really didn't have a lot of native musicians. So when the U.S. Marine Band, the president's own, recruited members to join that elite group, they went to Germany and to Europe to recruit musicians. So this is like the early part of the Republic's history. And, you know, I trace it up to American popular music up to a point, say, in 1826, the year that Stephen Foster was born. And the influence that music had, it seemed to be our first American folk music. But it wasn't really until after the incredible immigration of people from Europe, primarily Jewish people trying to escape tyranny in Russia and the Pilgrims, and then this other group of people who came here against their own will, came in shackles, the African Americans, the slaves who came here. When those two groups arrived and started intermingling culturally, we came up with this incredible music, jazz. Some of the rhythms are from Africa, some from South America. If you listen to, there's a famous story, Harold Arlen, who wrote so many famous songs, including Over the Rainbow, but his father was a cantor. And so Harold had just written, I've Got a Right to Sing the Blues, circa 1932, 1933, and Louis Armstrong recorded it. So Harold was in his bedroom listening to Louis's record, and his father, the cantor, went by, stopped and listened for a moment and said, "Harold, who is that guy?" And Harold said, "Well, Dad, that's like Louis Armstrong. He's singing my new song, I've Got a Right to Sing the Blues." And the cantor said, "Yeah, but he's stealing some of my chops." So that Louis's first integration with a family experience, as we know it, was when the Karnofsky family, Jewish immigrants from New Orleans, who had a scrap dealer business, hired Louis at 9 or 10 years old to play his little trumpet to announce that they were coming through the streets of New Orleans looking for refuge and junk and rubbish and that sort of thing. And Louis would eat at their home every night. They sort of adopted him. They became surrogate parents. And Louis always wore a Star of David and had matzah and made sure they packed his house with. So you can see right there, there was this cultural, I think, interchange between the two groups. And I suppose ultimately we define jazz as freedom of expression.
Gotcha.
That's the easy definition of it. And we can see these two groups coming together and creating it in the American experience.
Sure. And as you say there, New Orleans really is credited as jazz's birthplace. But in the early 20th century, you see many jazz artists move to Chicago. Why is that, and how did it influence their music?
Louis was one of those people. He moved up there after Joe Oliver, who was his great mentor, moved to Chicago, called Louis in New Orleans, who had never been out of the city, and said, "You've got to come up here." And that's when Louis first began to get attention. And there are all these little pockets breaking out all over the place. In New York, it was Harlem, and it was that area, that the Renaissance going on in that area. But I think what we find today is that in San Diego or on Cape Cod, there are these little pockets, little communities of jazz where it's cultivated and nourished. And I think that's what happened by another part that played in Chicago. Another important part of it, Doug, was the invention of radio, which it started with Marconi's first transatlantic message in January of 1903 from Cape Cod to England.
Sure.
And then commercial radio as we know it, what people say, like the Harding-Cox election returns in 1920, 1922, in that area, commercial radio became a part of the firmament in America. But by certainly 1925, 28, in that era, now the whole country could hear this music. They could tune in and listen to Count Basie in Kansas City and Benny Goodman playing in Chicago or New York. So that helped develop, made it a national music, I think.
Gotcha. As the music goes across the country, and again in the early decades of the 20th century, how does it change? What sort of influences does it see from its original birthplace in New Orleans, really?
There were different eras. It just had this sort of organic growth, I think. We start off with swing and big band, Dixieland, ragtime at the very beginning. We think of ragtime and how it evolved, and then the big band swing era, which was so important because each of these individual musicians were developing their chops and their skills, and then it moves into the bop era in the 50s. Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, that changed the music. And then Miles Davis and the people in the 50s and 60s came along. It's never remained stagnant. It's always new generations will bring some new interpretations to it. And it's a work in progress.
Sure. From what I've read and seen in sort of my research, and again, my knowledge is not as good as yours and as depth as yours, but a number of Black jazz artists moved to Paris, especially after World War I. Why were they there, and do you have any ideas or thoughts about how that move influenced their music?
Well, it brought our music to Europe, of course, but a lot of it was to escape institutionalized racism, where these incredible gifted artists who were revered around the world could play at a club, a paid gig, but they couldn't eat there. Or they couldn't, if they were playing at a hotel or something, they couldn't stay at that hotel, but they were hired to entertain people. And I think a lot of that must have, you can just project that onto your own experience, and it must have been just so disorienting, to say the least. I mean, and I think that's part of it, and plus the amazing embrace of the European audience for this American music. And I keep going, it's kind of a trite expression, but freedom of expression. I think they could discern in this music that I see jazz is sort of like the US Constitution. There are these ordained amendments and the ethics of the Constitution. We have to obey these rules, and we do this procedure, but there's room for improvisation and there's room to grow. That's why we have amendments to the Constitution. We had the Bill of Rights, but then we started adding amendments because the country was evolving, and we thought this has to be corrected. And I think they see jazz as sort of the same. Within that Constitution, a soloist can express how he's feeling in that moment. It's another part of it, the magic of it. It's when you listen to, I think of Tony Bennett, all the times I saw him, he might do a Duke Ellington song, Lucky So-and-so, but I'd never heard it done the same way twice. Was doing it in that moment, and I think that's another sort of earmark of jazz. It's there's room for that improvisation, and that the more honest an artist is and communicates how he feels, the more I think he creates an affinity with the audience.
Sure. When you think about jazz music, what makes it unique compared to other forms of music?
Well, I think it's the improvisational part of it. And it's that combination of melody and the rhythms in jazz. I think I'm more of, I guess, not an expert, but a student of the American Songbook. The American Songbook is the text, these American standards that jazz players use. Everyone, including Miles Davis to Louis My Funny Valentine, for instance, a song written by Richard Rodgers and Larry Hart. I mentioned Over the Rainbow. That was Harold Arlen and lyrics by Yip Harburg. Yip Harburg once said the reason the songs are so ingrained in our consciousness and why they have gained such adulation from the American public is, he said, a song, when you think of it, is music in words. And when you hear music, when you hear a sound, you feel a feeling. When you hear a word, the lyrics, you think a thought. When you hear one of these great songs, My Funny Valentine or Little Girl Blue, you think a feeling. It actually, there's a visceral reaction when you listen to it. And I think that's the part of the foundation of jazz.
Sure, sure. As you and I discussed earlier this week, music is one of those things that can sort of get you through a bad time, but then also make a celebration even better then too as well.
Exactly. I've always felt it was given to us by whatever creative forces you want to ascribe that put us here and imbued us with life as we know it. There was already a recognition that you're going to die, so you're not going to live forever. But along the way, between birth and death, you're going to experience marvelous highlights. You're going to have children. You're going to have luxury. You're going to have jobs. You're going to have friends. You're going to fall in love, fall out of love. But also there are going to be some very difficult times that come along. And music is sort of in our quiver, and we can just take up when something goes wrong, you pull out a Louis Armstrong West End Blues and put it on. And it doesn't make that wrong or the bad thing go away, but it helps you cope and deal with a little in a healthier way.
Sure, sure. When you think about the 10 or so musicians who really put jazz on the map, who would they be?
Well, I mean, there are just so many, Doug. And again, it's a very individual. It's a very specific thing. I would draw up a list that would say these names. Someone else might come over here who has more of a proclivity to bop or to modern jazz or to smooth jazz. They would have their own set of lists. So it's hard to say. So I would say more, but the people I feel at the very top is Louis Armstrong. And if you talk to every musician who played that instrument today, it would be Wynton Marsalis, I guess, at the one of the top. But all of the people, Roy Hargrove, who died only a few years ago at a young age, every trumpet player, Louis is the guy. Most saxophone players, iconic, Louis Armstrong. And then you talk to singers like Tony Bennett and Sinatra and Ella, and they said Louis was the. People said, Louis, a singer? I mean, with that gravelly voice and that sort of thing. But it was the soulfulness that he brought to everything he did. And again, that's part of the definition of jazz. So I put Louis there. I put Edward Kennedy, Duke Ellington, born in Washington, D.C. on April 29th, 1899, who came into his full chops and his full popularity when he went to Harlem in the Cotton Club days in the early 1930s. Count Basie for rhythm. I always think Basie, like that rhythm section with Freddie Green on guitar and Joe Jones on drums and Count at the piano. I mean, he set these tempos. Everyone was astounded by it. Ella and all of these people who sang with them. Astounded by it. And I have a proclivity too, I have to say, to singers. I think that singers, for me, are the ultimate realization of the art form because they're collaborating with musicians. And to have a great singer and a great musician doing the arrangement and conducting the orchestra and stuff, when you listen to Ella Fitzgerald sing with the Duke Ellington Orchestra, for instance, to me, that's the epitome. And it goes on. And I mean, for every era, the cool jazz, I think Dave Brubeck, when he came in the 50s, the great ambassadors, I think of Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, and that whole school came along and nourished and fed jazz. And then the Latin influences that Cal Tjader and all the Latin people came along. And so it's hard to come up with a list of, I love the Mel Torme. I love Sarah Vaughan, Carmen McRae, all of the female singers who came out of that school. And so I guess I couldn't come up with a definitive top list.
Sure.
I tell you what, there is a terrific project that came along, I would recommend. And John Hassey, Dr. John Hassey, who's been the guest oftentimes on the radio program during the month of April, because he created Jazz Appreciation Month. John was curator, he's curator emeritus now of American music at the Smithsonian. And he came up with this incredible concept that the Smithsonian started now. I think it's probably 15 to 20 years old, April declaring it Jazz Jam, Jazz Appreciation Month. And it was sort of arbitrary. He selected April because it's the start of the baseball season, it's spring, but also this proliferation of artists, jazz giants like Ella, like Duke, like Carmen McRae, like Billie Holiday. I didn't mention her to Billie Holiday, my God. They were all born during the month of April. So John and a couple of his colleagues came up with the Smithsonian Anthology. And I've always thought, it's online, you can go and see it. It's about 100 different tracks, beautifully annotated with the history of each track and its significance, and why they elected to put it into this. 100 is hardly the beginning of the tip of the iceberg in the music. But for certain historical reasons and the sort of questions you're asking me, they selected those tracks. And it's a wonderful, if you really want to learn about the music and the history, it's a great mechanism, great platform.
I'm thinking about just Miles Davis here for a second. He seems like a real rebel in many cases. As the story goes, he sees fewer people coming into jazz clubs. And if I'm right, it becomes the inspiration for his album Bitches Brew.
Right.
How would you describe him, and how would you describe that album?
Well, I mean, my favorite one is All Blues, of course, which is on everyone's list of Kind of Blue, and it's such a significant part of the music and of our cultural history. But he, not unlike all of the people who were in the music at that time, were being pushed to the margins by post-World War II. The big bands could not subsidize traveling around the country with 18 to 20 guys. So they're all like breaking from the big bands and looking for gigs. Simultaneous with that is the boomer generation coming along out of the 50s. These are the people who embraced rock and roll in 1958, 59. So that was pushing this music to the margins. And even today, I mean, the golden era for it, I believe, was probably the big band swing era, where the music was it was the popular culture of the day. But Miles had to compete with all the other new stuff that was coming along. And I can understand the sort of bitterness that an artist like that was just so incredibly gifted should be moved to the margins, pushed to the margins by this new rock and roll music that was coming along.
Yeah, he seemed very, very frustrated from what I've seen.
Yes,
all the way, not only with what was going on culturally in the United States, but then also with his own record company too, as well.
And that's again, we forget at times, because we love listening to the music. It is business. Right. It's a big business, and record companies they want something that sits on the shelf for a very, very limited amount of time and is quickly replaced by a new product to keep that product coming out. Well, a lot of these guys were classic artists. They wanted to do something that would be permanent, not temporary, not pander to the taste of the day and stuff. So guys like Miles, although he demanded freedom of expression. And I think here we are talking about him and what he achieved. So ultimately, we don't remember who the producers were then or who was running Columbia Records at the time. But we do remember the artistry.
Absolutely. The names of some of the early jazz musicians are pretty creative. I mean, I'm thinking about, Cannonball Adderley and Jelly Roll Morton. Any idea where these names came from and how they came about?
Well, a lot of it, I think of Pops. I think of Louis he had been calling himself Pops, everyone around him. He had a thing where someone said, why you refer to as Pops? Why do you call yourself Pops? And he said, I meet so many people in the after concerts and dressing rooms and stuff. I can't always remember their names. And it's embarrassing. They'll come up a year later and say, hey, Louis, how you doing? You remember me, don't you? And he said, I don't. So I found it was easier just calling everyone Pops. So that's the story behind that story. But there's a history, I'm sure, with each of those nicknames.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. When you think about jazz in American culture, I mean, it's very, very important to American culture. Any thoughts about that? About what jazz does for American culture, how it really reflects the culture too, as well?
Well, again, I keep coming back, Doug, to freedom of expression.
Yeah.
We're a country that Statue of Liberty was built, and give me your tired, give me your poor, give me your huddled masses. People yearning to be free. They didn't come only for job opportunities, economic opportunities, which the country allowed, but because the culture of the country seemed to be pretty big. A lot of European companies were married to traditions that were centuries and centuries old. We're still relatively new entity. And so that it encouraged freedom of expression, new growth, new ways of approaching music and songs and that sort of thing. And I think that has a big attraction around the world, I think. And I think I think I mentioned to you that famous cartoon that was in the New Yorker back in the 1950s at the height of the Cold War, after Lewis and Dizzy and Benny Goodman had made these State Department sponsored jazz ambassador trips around the world, because even behind the Iron Curtain, they loved our American music. Willis Conover at the Voice of America in Washington had this program that no one domestically knew about it or listened to it. I did as a kid because I had a shortwave radio, and I just loved the way he spoke and his knowledge of music. And but he would have live in the studio at the Voice of America studios up on Independence Ave in Washington in the 50s and the early 60s, Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, because all around the world people were listening to this American music. He introduced it through the radio to them. And the cartoon in the New Yorker had a group of anxious-looking folks around a round table at the State Department, and very anxious expressions on their faces. And the chair of the meeting is saying, "We have a very serious situation going on in Europe today with the Russians and communists and the United States, and we have to make a decision today to help quell the embers that are flaring there that could provoke a war or confrontation. We have to decide whether we should send Secretary of State John Foster Dulles or Louis Armstrong." And that's the impact that the music had. I mean, I think of international artists who have come here, but I don't think they have affected the whole, maybe the Latin musicians who created the bossa nova in the 60s, who really had a national impact on us. The Beatles but that's a different genre, in 64 from England maybe, and the British invasion. But our American jazz and American song classics have a universal audience.
Sure. Who are today's musicians who are really keeping this musical art form going?
Oh, there are many. I mentioned him earlier, but he is a force that is to be reckoned with, and that's Wynton Marsalis. I think Wynton, not only his virtuosity as a musician and a composer, but his sense of I just wish he was sitting here next to me and could jump in and answer some of your questions, because his sense of the history of this music and its place in our cultural history in the United States is so formidable. So I look to him, and there are just a lot of, again, every generation, I was the jazz historian on the jazz cruise for 4 years up until COVID came along. And the jazz cruise, which sails out of Miami every year for a week, has this crop of young people, a lot of them from the Frost School of Music at the University of Miami. Shelley Berg, who is the head of that department, recruits a lot of the younger, Emmett Kelly, the pianist, a lot of amazing young, but also Jeff Clayton and the Clayton brothers and Jeff Hamilton, the drummer, and all the middle generation coming together. And you could just see on the faces of the young musicians, they come in and they just love learning from these master musicians. So it's an American tradition, and it'll just keep growing.
Sure, sure. If I'm correct, there are about 15,000 radio stations, maybe over 15,000 radio stations in the United States. But from what I could gather, only about 83 seem to spend any time playing jazz. I mean, what does this say about the genre of music?
Well, I don't think it's so much the genre of music, Doug, as the lack of historical reference and the lack of sort of a obligation, if you're an owner or programmer, you might have to say, we have to make room on those 15,000 stations. I know you have KSDS, I believe.
Yeah.
In that area. And I haven't listened to them recently, but I used to listen to them online. You can go online and hear a lot of stations, but that's been a huge problem. I mean, what I've done is and getting, I always refer to it, I get away with doing this because it's not something that's encouraged or pandered or easy to sell to a station owner. They're not interested. They're looking for demographics. They want people in that certain age. And but without having a background on marketing, I believe a lot of that is because the younger you are, the more impulsive you are about making decisions. Sure. Whatever school you're going to, where this sort of music, you kind of go, you watch an artist kind of grow and stay with them and watch them morph into the next period of growth and stuff. And, Tony Bennett, I think, was in his lifetime, among the extraordinary things he accomplished, he always decried the fact, he used to say, these radio station people, these record companies, they keep telling young people that's old music. George and Ira Gershwin's "It's Very Clear, Our Love Is Here to Stay," that's old music. Don't listen to it. It's old. Irving Berlin, all of that is old music. And Tony would always say, no, it's not old music. It's America's classical music. We went through a renaissance culturally at that point with the big bands and jazz and these songs from Tin Pan Alley and Broadway and were being produced. It's not old music. So he believed that, and he was steadfast in that belief, and ended up in 1995 winning Grammy of the Year album, not just for traditional pop, but the album of the year, and it was MTV Unplugged, Tony Bennett.
Wow.
And Your Honor, I submit as Exhibit A that CD, because on that CD, he didn't pander to the audience. He sang, I believe he did Our Love Is Here to Stay. He did It Amazes Me. He did One for My Baby. He did all of these American standards to incredible, enthusiastic audiences. So, to me, it's almost criminal that it's been marginalized and pushed to the margins in our popular culture. That we miss. You could turn on like even the Johnny Carson show, and you'd see some of these people, Buddy Rich, or some of the great singers come out, Sarah Vaughan, and there was a forum, a platform for them on a national level. So I know.
You mentioned earlier Jazz Appreciation Month, which is coming up in April. How does this help, keep jazz going, keep it, in front and center in people's minds? What does it do for everybody?
One of the essential elements of it is creating these incredible educational packages, which are distributed and available for high schools, public and private high schools, all around the country. And they're packets of historical books, documents, and music on these artists. I always believed, Doug, that, like when I lectured in the music department at GW, how do you approach a group of 20-year-olds, 22, 23 years old, and talk about Ella Fitzgerald? This was only a couple of years ago. So I always believe this, it's not unique, but I always believe before you play a note, start with a story about this person born in 1917 who dropped out of high school, had a very abusive situation as a child in Harlem. When she was growing up with her mother, her stepfather was very abusive. She ran away from home. She was arrested for being a delinquent, never got into any major trouble. She was a beautiful soul, and she loved dancing. That was a very big thing in Harlem at that time. Kids would stand on the street corners and dance, and people would pay them money, throw money. It was very big. And there was this at the Apollo Club in Harlem. There was an amateur night. They had just started this amateur night where they would have professional, great names, Billy Eckstine and people like that come and play. But they would select 8 candidates or something like that for their amateur night. Her friends persuaded her to sign up. She signed up. She wanted to be a dancer. She was going on to be a dancer. And at this point in that classroom with 22-year-old, I've said, now listen to what happened. And I'll play an audio clip of Andre Previn interviewing Ella in the 70s. So she said, I got out there on stage. I was the first amateur to appear. And out on stage, taking bow after their incredible performance, were the 2 dancing sisters in Harlem. And she named, I forget the name now. They were like very famous and very incredible. And Ella looked and she said, no way I'm going to go out and dance after them. And she said, but then they announced me and I had to come out on stage. And Previn said, well, what did you do? And she said, well, my mother loved Connie Boswell, and she used to play Connie Boswell records at home. And there was one particular song that she played I loved, Hoagie Carmichael's song, Judy. La da 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 da, la da. So I sang Judy. And the audience went crazy. And the MC said, you have to do an encore. And he said, and Previn said, so what did you do? She said, well, I sang Judy again. It's the only song I knew. But she said later in an interview, she said in that moment when she was receiving that applause, she knew that this is what she was going to do for the rest of her life. And then I'll say to the class, now listen to what happened. See, she had a backup plan. Always have a backup plan in life. Ella, here she is, nervous, kind of gangly, off the street, going out in front of this rowdy audience, at the Apollo Theater. You had to impress them. But rather than collapse or fall apart, she reached into that quiver, she took out singing. And here she is in Germany, and she starts singing Mac the Knife. And have you ever heard that recording of Ella in Germany?
No, I'm familiar with the song, not that. No.
Well, you can find it on YouTube.
Sure.
And she forgets the lyrics, but she's singing on what are the lyrics? I forget. And she goes on to do a 3-minute vamp on Mac the Knife that has become iconic, that now everyone looks to say that's the definitive version. Again, she reached it. She had a backup act, right, and she took that out. But just an incredible, and again, you see another element of jazz in there, improvisation. She came out, she improvised her life. So I'm gone way off track, but I find telling the stories of these people is like essential before young people can understand and begin to empathize. Once you've successfully done that and pointed out some of the situations they had to overcome, they weren't born stars. They had to overcome a lot of crap to get to that point. A lot of hard work, a lot of dedication, a lot of ambition to do the very best they possibly could. Then they become Ella Fitzgerald or Louis Armstrong or Duke.
Right. I think that's true with sports too as well. Everybody seems to think the quarterback drops back, throws the touchdown pass, but they don't realize, as with the musician, all the training, all the tears, all the anxiety uh, and certainly all the practice that it took to get there, too, as well. It just doesn't show up one day. So it must be interesting when you tell those stories about some of these people who became, the early American jazz stars. It must help. It must have helped, your students really relate to who they were.
Yeah, you take just pulling something out of the air. You say, if you can close your eyes for a moment and think it's 1915. That's very early. The plane was only like 12 years old. Kitty Hawk was 12 years old. Marconi was 12 in 1915, and it's Hoboken, New Jersey. And there's a doctor in a room trying to assist a lady in delivering this baby, and he's having a lot of problems because the mother is a very slight, small lady, and the baby is turned out to be something like 13 pounds. And the doctor can't deliver the baby, has to use forceps and has to pull the baby out. And in doing that, tears the baby's ear, tears the skin, and it's really a mass of just tissue and blood. And there's an Italian immigrant grandmother in the room watching all of this, blessing herself like this. And she takes the doctor's trying to revive the mother now. The grandmother takes that mass of tissue and blood and brings it over, turns the cold water on the sink, sticks under the faucet, and the baby starts crying. That was the first sound that Frank Sinatra made.
Well,
and he kept those scars on his face for his daughter Nancy wrote in her book, for his entire life, to remind him of what he heard when he was growing up. Do something with your life. You came this close to not being here. There's a reason for you being here. And that always reminded him. And he went on to become Frank Sinatra.
Absolutely.
So I think we as human beings, whether you're 20 or you're 80, you identify with the human experience first. And then you forget, because it becomes so iconic, as you say, football, they're so big and beyond, it's been so easy and stuff. We forget they're like us, they're flesh and bone and that sort of thing.
Let me ask you, what's the difference between jazz and the blues and jazz and ragtime? Is there a distinguishable difference between those sets of music?
Yeah, well, there is. I mean, they are different subsets of jazz, I think. But their elements they're intertwined. The ragtime helped create the rhythm, I think. And when Duke Ellington, these folks came along 15 years or so after that, 20 years after that, the blues, I think, always, those Jewish immigrant composers like Harold Arlen and George Gershwin, they used to hang around in Harlem at the Cotton Club listening to the black musicians playing, and they absorbed a lot of those feelings that they heard from the blues and from that music. They incorporated them into the American standards. So there's this cross-pollination that went on continually, I think.
Gotcha. American novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald, referred to the 1920s as the jazz age. Did that help cement jazz into the American consciousness?
Yeah, I think it did. And I think, again, Doug, there was a whole constellation of events going on. By that time, World War I had been fought and won, but had scarred and left some incredible pain in the country. And this music was coming on, sort of relief from a lot of that. And in 1927, we had, with Al Jolson and the jazz singer, we had the first talking motion pictures. So now this music is becoming part of soundtracks. And of course, radio, I can never diminish and dismiss the importance that radio had as delivering this music throughout the country, making it a national music.
Well, what's the demographic these days that you think finds jazz the most appealing?
Well, from my own personal experience, I find it's a lot of people in their 40s and 50s, and the baby boomers, so those are folks now in their 60, 65, retiring now, and 65, 70, they grew up sort of as I did, in that age where you could, in 1956, 57, 58, you could love Elvis Presley, but you'd also hear Earl Garner on the radio. and you'd hear a lot of these, and you could love. So you experienced Errol Garner, and you loved all of this music. My ambition, I always think of me as having the ability to be sort of a guy who can open the gate for people in their imagination to a young person who may accidentally walk into a room where the radio program is on, or be driving in a car with someone who was selected to listen to American jazz. And that young person, I know this anecdotally, that it works, that they'll hear Lewis and Ella singing together. And they say, who are those people? That's beautiful. Summertime. Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald. So it was, well, that's Louis, and that's Ella, and that's George and Ira Gershwin, that's Porgy and Bess, 1935, and never assign a year to it because you don't want them to say that's old music. But they hear it, and it transcends time, and you'll hear Nat King Cole sing Stardust or something. So I always sort of in that middle road. Then the people who know the music, who grew up with it, who are far more informed about it than I am, those people will enjoy it too, because they say, oh yeah, that's great, that's kind of blue, or that's Louis Armstrong and West End Blues, or that sort of thing.
Jazz has a few interpretations outside of U.S. borders. In particular, I'm thinking about Latin jazz, Brazilian jazz. Stan Getz was involved in some of this. Can you explain those versions of jazz?
Yeah, I think as I know the story, because it happened in Washington, D.C. in the early 1960s, Charlie Byrd had been traveling through South America, playing, the great guitarist who grew up in that area, and just loved the music. So he brought it back, and there was a guy on the radio in Washington who played a lot of this music, and Charlie brought back some of the Latin records, said you should play some of this music, it's fantastic. So that would have been like 58, 59. And finally Charlie and Stan Getz, he talked to Stan Getz about it, who was also infatuated with the bossa nova from Brazil, and they went into a church in Washington in 1962, February of 62, and recorded the album Desafinado, which went on to be this iconic in this jazz anthology from the Smithsonian. There's a representation of that area that Dr. Hasse selected, and that's the Astrid Gilberto Stan Getz record of Girl from Ipanema with Jobim. And that helped really in this, and that was an international event too, because the bossa nova was embraced by all of Europe when it first became popularized in this country. So and it's still one of the most infectious, to me, rhythms. I love that sound.
Sure. Your show runs for 4 hours each week. How long does it take you to produce it, and how do you select the artists?
It takes about 5 hours to produce a 4-hour program. It takes as little time in terms of prep, because I'm really preparing it as I do it. It's like a jazz performance. I know what I have to do. I have an hour here to fill, and there is that formula, that structure. For me, it's like you don't want to play 2 or 3 vocals together or 2 or 3 instrumentals together, and that's just a proclivity. That's my own sort of thing, because I always believe you're trying to constantly keep it interesting for the listener. If you hear 3 instrumentals, 4 instrumentals, sometimes it's like, oh, another instrumental, it becomes the same old thing, or 3 or 4 female singers, 3 or 4 male singers. So to break it up and change the rhythm and tempos down, you started off with a lot of energy on that, bring it down a little bit. Here's a perfect time for a ballad right in here. Johnny Hartman with John Coltrane, and They Say It's Wonderful. Perfect spot for that. McCoy Tyner on piano. And you'd come out of that and you'd say, how about Dave McKenna and a Harry Warren song, and that. So that's how I do it. It's like a performance. But I do listen to everything in real time. I've always believed that you really can't be effective doing it unless you can vicariously be the performer and the listener simultaneously. Now, a lot of the era we're in now with AI and Spotify and that sort of thing has removed that whole part of it. You just say, I want this, I want that, and it pops up. But I do think that I grew up with the human touch in creating these programs, and I I haven't been convinced otherwise that that's the best way to do it.
So when you do the show at 7 o'clock Eastern time on Saturday morning on the Real Jazz Channel, are you live on the radio?
No, I'm not.
Yeah.
I've recorded the program on Cape Cod.
Gotcha.
I recorded on actually a very antiquated, speaking of the Smithsonian, a way of doing it. I put it on CD. I actually burned a CD.
Yeah.
I have 2 CD players, a CD burner,
Yep.
and a mixing board and my microphone, and I just boom, 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 and here it is, and there's that, and then after the CD is finished, I convert it into a WAV file on my computer, and I'm able to send those WAV files to the server at Sirius Radio in New York, and then I check with Chris Lee, this terrific support guy in New York. I say, Chris, I sent over the February program for this. Would you check and make sure all the files are there? And usually everything's fine.
Right.
So that's how it goes. I'm never, I don't do it live. I'm usually actually taping another program while the one that's on the air is playing, because that's a good time for me to produce.
How did the show American Jazz come about?
In 1999, Tony Bennett called me and said, Dick, I received the business card of a guy who, his name is Michael Friedman, and he's the general manager of CBS Radio News. Parenthetically, Tony was such a great friend and mentor, and was always saying, Dick, you've got to find a bigger platform. You're having all this wonderful success in the Cape and you love doing it, but you should be doing it. And I, think, oh my God, just to have his imprimatur was enough. But he called and he said, he said, what I'd like to do is meet Michael Friedman, and then get you into a conference with Michael, you and I, and let's sit down and see if there's an opportunity at CBS Radio to do your program on CBS. And Michael was, it was instant karma. I went down to New York and he came up from Washington, and Michael and Tony met with us. It was a terrific meeting. And Michael went off and explored, but there was nothing, CBS wasn't interested in a music format or anything like that. But Michael still said, I'm going, he was a broadcaster originally. And so he left CBS and went to the George Washington University in 2001 as vice president of external relations. He got in touch with me again. He said, Dick, I have a concept. Why don't we this is Duke Ellington's hometown. The university is located 4 blocks from the White House, but also 4 blocks from Duke Ellington's birthplace and Ward Place and in the West End of Washington. Why don't we put GWs, put the Duke Ellington imprimatur on GW? We'll do a program, we'll call it American Jazz. So Mike was just an extraordinarily creative guy. He got, actually, before we did the first program, I guess after the first program, he wanted to create CDs of the program that could be distributed to people at the university and that sort of thing. And he commissioned Al Hirschfeld to do a caricature of the Louis Armstrong trumpet. That's how much care and attention went to it. So he, after the first couple of weeks and the first label that went on the CD, he sent it to Tony, one of the programs. And Tony then called me. He said, my God, he said, first of all, there was the Hirschfeld, which appealed to Tony's artistic ambitions. He has 3 paintings at Smithsonian museums in Washington. Very accomplished painter in addition to being a singer. And then the content, the program itself, appealed to his music sensibility and history. So he said, I have an idea. He said, there's this new satellite radio service that just started in Washington. It's called XM Radio. And I know a few people there. Let me call and see who the CEO is and see if I could make a meeting. And he called and he got a meeting with Hugh Panaro. Mike and I came over from GW. Tony came in from New York. And now XM is only like about a year old or something at this point. And we went into Mr. Panaro's office and he had a Tony Bennett CD playing in the background. He said, before you say anything, whatever it is, Tony, you want, you have it. And Tony said, well, no, he said, I really think this program and Dick's experience in the music and GW and Duke Ellington and all the elements. And So it began in 2002 on XM, and then in 2008, XM merged with Sirius.
Right.
XM went on first, and everyone thought XM would ultimately win the satellite radio war.
Sure.
But Sirius, which went on several months later, actually had more subscribers at the beginning. But when they merged, Sirius said, we're going to keep your American Jazz program on. And then in 2020, Mark Ruffin, the program director, expanded it to 4 hours with an encore at midnight.
Oh, very good. Very good. Two things, from listening to your show, and I've been listening to it, for a number of years now, I always sense there's this great passion that you bring and love that you bring to the music as well as the artist. Where does it come from, and when did it start?
I think it starts with my own life, my own experience. I know and knew when I was probably 9 or 10 when I first heard that music, which was not the music of the day predominantly at that time, but especially my mother had the radio on all the time to stations that played this type of music, these artists. And I began to, beyond listening and oh, that's a nice melody or this sort of thing, there was a real visceral feeling on who these people were. And as I evolved, got into my teen years and that sort of thing, the fusion of the technology radio, which I thought was magic. I mean, there are all these signals traveling through the air, and we're not aware they're there until you turn the radio on, then they come out. So there's the magic of communications, but then communicating through this incredible music, which was also magical. So it to me, there wasn't a choice. The two things I thought, this is something I would love to do, is be able to have a radio program where I could play this music, because I know what it does for me. It lifts my spirits. If you're feeling down or upset or something, it always will step in right up to the plate and help you navigate whatever you're going through. And if you're feeling incredibly joyful and happy, it can enhance that part of it too.
Sure.
So I think that's where it began. And it's never diminished or dwindled. I mean, it's been tough navigating the cultural changes and the technical changes, and the fact, as you pointed out, that it's really marginalized by people who control the mechanisms, who own the radio stations, and it's very difficult to break through that. That's not to say there aren't some very enlightened people out there, but I've never lost my passion for it.
Sure. One of the things I've noticed is that you do, which would be easy, I think, for someone to overlook, is that you credit all the artists who are playing on the individual song. It's not just the lead one, like the singer or maybe the lead saxophone player, or the lead trumpeter. I mean, you're crediting everybody who is participating in making that song happen. It would seem that would be, in some ways, a bit unique.
Well, I love spreading the credit around, and especially when it comes to composers and lyricists, because it's when we hear a fully realized song like Blue Skies, smiling at me, nothing but blue skies do I see, 1926, words and music by Irving Berlin. Yeah. He and Cole Porter hold that distinction of being both. Jimmy Durante because they wrote the words and music, Jimmy Durante used to say, that song was written by Cole Porter, and Cole Porter, he wrote the words and the music. And but to hear, to think there's a Richard Rodgers melody, and then My Funny Valentine, Sweet Comic Valentine, Larry Hart's lyrics are just so you have these two geniuses collaborating, coming up with the text. And then you have someone like Sarah Vaughan or one of these singers going in and looking at it and saying, well, I know, I'm going to do this with it. And a sax player and a pianist coming together with an arrangement on it. So it is a group experience, but as the listener, it's only Sarah Vaughan.
Right.
And then you listen a bit longer, but now it's the pianist, now it's the saxophonist, now it's the trumpet guy. So it's a beautiful collective creation and collective experience listening to it.
Sure. Tell us about your friendship with Tony Bennett. And if I'm correct, you two actually collaborated on a book.
We did in 2017. on stage and in the studio. And my friendship goes back to about the first time I met Tony was when I was in college in the early 60s in Boston. And I had a chance to interview him. This was after I left my heart in San Francisco, which he recorded in January of 1962. He was at the top of his game. I mean, it was in that early 60s, in the early 60s after San Francisco, there was The Good Life and I Want to Be Around, and just hit If I Ruled the World, and all hit after hit. Who Can I Turn To? So it was very hot at the time I met him, and I loved his music. I mean, the first Tony Bennett record I embraced was from 1959, 58, 59, an album he did called Hometown, My Town, just with Ralph Burns arrangements. It was just beautiful. I Cover the Waterfront, Penthouse Serenade, beautiful, beautiful concept album. But I just couldn't, when I went to interview him, I was so nervous. And I brought a lady friend of mine who loved him, this lady I was dating and at the time, Linda Gordon, and she was so excited. We're going in to interview Tony in his dressing room, and I have my little Wallensack tape recorder, and I'm so nervous, and we're sitting on the couch, and Tony is like, everything is so easy, and we're calm down, and he's just so nice to have you here. I hope you enjoyed the show. So I started the tape recorder, and I said, and there's Linda sitting over here, and Tony's here, and I'm here, and Tony, I know you can't turn the radio on today without hearing Who Can I Turn To? It's such a, thank you very much. And I said, but I have to admit something. My favorite track on the album is that song, Carolyn Lee, Cy Coleman's song, I Walk a Little Faster. And that Tony Bennett smile came on his face. And he looked over at Linda. This is the lady I'm dating. And he points at me and he said, finally, a DJ with ears. So
right.
Obviously that made me feel like, Linda, oh my God, did you hear what he said? So it started there, and then through the years, and then the story moves along till in the early 1980s when Beverly and Bill Carmen purchased the Cape Cod Melody Tent in Hyannis, and they had listened to the program I was doing on the Cape, and I played Tony all the time, and they said, we'd love to have Tony Bennett at the Cape Cod Melody Tent. Can you put us together with his manager and his management team? And I got some contact information, passed it on to him. They invited him, and for 30 years, he came to the Cape Cod Melody Tent. And each year he came, our personal relationship just blossomed. And within 2 years or so, he was inviting me to New York to his family Christmas parties and to do this and do that. And it just blew. And then we started talking on the phone for several years. It was almost a daily, after he finished painting in his studio at home, he would call me about 4:00 in the afternoon, and we'd have these incredible phone conversations that ranged. I mean, we talked the business of life, and Tony's had such a, I don't think a conversation ended without him saying, Dick, I am the luckiest guy in the world. I count my blessings every single day. I am just so lucky. He was a guy coming out of the Depression, losing his father to congestive heart disease when Tony was about 10 years old, Italian immigrant parents, all of going through the Depression, all of going through World War II, marching with Dr. King in Selma, all of that history. He was a guy who, he actually had a gun. He saw people killed in World War II. He said, he was a total human being. He was a humanist. He disdained false patriotism, he would call it, I mean, we're all patriots. This is our planet that we live on. We all should be patriots of the planet. He was like that. Loved America and what America represented to the world. But and that's why his constituency in terms of demographics and race and gender and all of that were so different, universal, because people discern that in him. People used to say, to me, "Oh, you have a friendship with Tony Bennett. What's he really like?"
Yeah.
And because they were curious, and and I said, "Well, what's your perception? What do you think he's?" "Well, he just seems like such a nice guy. I mean, I saw him last night on the Carson show, and he's just so terrific. I mean, he's always kind. He never says anything that's crude or rude, and nothing, never puts anyone down. And he has a beautiful smile. But what's he really like?" And I'll say, "Well, multiply your impressions by 10. And that's where he's really like on the phone at 4 o'clock in the afternoon."
Yeah.
He just had the most incredible temperament and fixation on only wanting to give the public the best. I mean, if you're with Tony Bennett, and no matter how long he was doing it, right up to the end when you went, rarely did I go in before a show because I never wanted to be a distraction in the green room. But 15, 20 minutes, a half hour before Tony went on, he said, "Excuse me," he said, "I have to go in and get my vocalizing done now." Every night, he said, "Well, you sang last night. You're going to sing tomorrow night." And the door would shut. You'd hear him in there with an opera record on, doing all. And you say, "My God, he cares that much."
Right.
Everything is, and that's why what I learned from that, Doug, is when you're sitting in the audience at Radio City Music Hall on his 90th birthday concert, when he came into the room, into the hall with Susan Benedetto, his wife, at the moment he got a standing ovation. He wasn't announced. The audience just looked over and saw him coming in, and he got a standing ovation. And that's for as much as artistry as who he was as a person. Duke Ellington said about him in Duke's autobiography, "Music is My Mistress." The first line on his chapter on Tony Bennett is, "Tony Bennett is a Christian, period. And he lives like one, period." And he wasn't talking about religion, he was talking about a philosophy. Forgive thy neighbor, all the stuff that goes under that umbrella. That's what he embodied and practiced.
Yeah. I read somewhere that you have a charcoal portrait of Duke Ellington. Who is the artist?
Tony Bennett. He gave that to me as a gift around the time in 1999, he won a Grammy for his tribute. Bennett sings Ellington Hot and Cool with Wynton Marsalis on a couple of tracks, Al Gray, the great trombonist, on a couple of tracks, and these beautiful arrangements of Duke Ellington's music. And one night when I was in New York, it was just a great evening. And Susan and I had dinner, and he had brought this package. It was all wrapped. He said, "I have something for you." And I'd go in and take it off the wall, but it would be but it was this beautiful charcoal of Duke Ellington that I treasure. And he did one. I think he must have done a couple. He was warming up, because there's one on the CD cover, and I have to look closer to see if it's this one, but it's just beautiful. And Ellington, that's another part. Tony he said, "I always thank Duke." In the 70s, Duke said to Tony, "You've got to be more serious about your painting." And Tony was painting very well at that time, but Duke used to paint privately. And Tony said, "Well, Duke," he said, "make the time. Not having enough time isn't the excuse." He said, "I write, I conduct an orchestra, I play piano, and I paint. So make time for your painting." And that really, hearing that from Duke Ellington, inspired Tony to really become serious about painting. And he became Tony Bennett, the painter. As I mentioned, 3 paintings at the Smithsonian museums, and just this great career as a painter. But he said, by virtue of doing that and focusing on my paint, he said, "I've never wander out of my creative zone. When I get tired of singing, becomes burdensome or whatever, I go into the art studio and I paint. And when the easel and paints and brushes, enough stuff that I'm exhausted by that, I go out on stage and I sing. But I'm always in that zone creating." And that was because of Duke, who just loved him and loved Tony's whole family. I mean, I mentioned Tony's dad died when Tony was 10. in 1936. Tony's mother was born in September of 1899. Duke's was born in April of 1899. I always felt the way Tony talked and the things Duke Ellington did personally for Tony, he was like a surrogate father to Tony. He just loved, because Tony espoused all those human qualities that Duke loved and found attractive in people, and his humanity, and number one. So it's interesting.
Interesting. Let me ask you this: your friendship with Frank Sinatra. You wrote that letter to him when you're working at the radio station in Cape Cod, and lo and behold, something that no one would ever have probably expected. Frank Sinatra actually replies. Tell us about that.
You know, I wrote in 1983, in August of 83, I know I was a runner for about 20 years, and one of my rituals on Saturday morning was to go to the radio station. And before I started taping any programs, to go out for a 6-mile run, a route I used from Hyannis on Main Street. I would go through the back way, down through Hyannisport, past the Kennedy compound, and then make a loop around and come back to the radio station. Before I left the radio station, I was lacing up my sneakers, and I saw there in the New York Times front page story that they had just announced the Kennedy Center honorees for 1983, and among the 5 was Frank Sinatra. I thought, oh my God, I've watched that program every year when they show it over the holidays, the Kennedy Center honors, to see Sinatra being honored. I saw Ella's and Benny Goodman's, I think, but I kept waiting. So Sinatra's in his 60s at this time, and I was just so thrilled to see it was finally going to happen. So I laced up my sneakers, and I'm running through Hyannisport, and I thought, I'm going to write a letter, a congratulatory letter to Sinatra. He'll never see it, but I am so moved by this experience that I'm going to go and write a letter. So when I came back from my run, I went to an Underwood typewriter and pecked and wrote a 2-page letter to Frank Sinatra. In my letter, I identified that I'm a radio guy and that I so appreciated his artistry, because I think for people in my generation, people grew up listening to his Capitol records, not the RCA, Tommy Dorsey records, or the later Columbia things he did, but people who grew up when he started in 1953 with Capitol, those Nelson Riddle, Only the Lonely, Songs for Swinging Lovers, all of those albums. You helped open the minds of young people to this incredible accomplishment, these American songwriters, the way you did Cole Porter's music, Gershwin's music, and your own special artistry and your total involvement in this. So just a little room, and my congratulations and best wishes. And I went to the post office. I knew he lived in Rancho Mirage, and I got the zip code and wrote Francis Albert Sinatra, Rancho Mirage, California. The zip, put a stamp on it, put it in the mailbox, and that, as they say, is that. I had totally forgot about it. Then in October, I received a letter. Didn't recognize the return address. It was North Formosa Avenue, Los Angeles. Opened it, and there's FS, Frank Sinatra Stationery, and a beautiful hand-typed, because there were a couple of typos in the letter, with an FS/1 on the bottom of it, so he had typed it himself. Dear Richard. And the thing, it took me a couple of years, Doug, to fully appreciate this, is he said that, I think his first line was something, your words moved me. Your words move me. I was just so excited about, and in the middle of, he said, if there's anything I can do for you and your station to show my appreciation, perhaps a holiday greeting, please let me know. I wrote back, and because he said holiday greeting, it's now, I got the letter, his letter, I should have said, I don't know whether I did, in October, sent mine in August, got his in October. He's talking holiday. I'm thinking he must be thinking Christmas or Thanksgiving, and he's Frank Sinatra. So I didn't want to hold him to a deadline. I said, even if it was a generic greeting, you could do it anytime at your leisure. Would be honored to have that.
Sure.
And so that was October. And then in November, I actually had tickets to a Frank Sinatra concert in Worcester. My brother-in-law and I were going to go and see him in concert. And all of a sudden, early in the series of concerts, early in November, one night on the CBS Evening News, it was like the second item. Dan Rather said, Frank Sinatra has been forced to cancel a series of concerts because of a viral strep throat infection, something like that, and he has suspended his current tour, something like that. And so I thought, oh my God, I hope everything's going to be okay. Early December, I get a cassette tape in the mail with a cover letter from a producer. Mr. Sinatra, very pleased to produce these greetings for your audience and send you best wishes. And I put the cassette tape on, and you hear the most identifiable speaking voice. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Well, howdy, Richard. You probably thought I forgot your letter, misplaced your letter, but I had this, and he's talking like you and I are speaking your tone. You probably think I lost your letter, but actually I had this, the doctors didn't even have a name for it, some throat thing, and I had to cancel a lot of one-nighters, and I'm back out on the road now. But I'd like to get these greetings, holiday greetings done for your audience. So why don't we start here? He did a Christmas greeting, he did a New Year's greeting, he did a Mother's Day greeting, a 4th of July greeting, and then he did about 4 just generic greetings. Hi, everyone. You're listening to Dick Golden on WQRC in Hyannis, Massachusetts. He plays the best, Nat King Cole, Ella Fitzgerald, and I hope the signal's getting out to all the ships at sea and all the dinghies, too. This is Sinatra, Frank Sinatra, like that. I mean, it was the most phenomenal thing. And a couple of points. One, I think maybe subconsciously, my inspiration for writing the letter when I was running by the Kennedy compound, and it didn't occur to me till years later, was that he had been there.
Oh, yeah, sure, of course. Right.
He was very familiar with the Kennedy compound. He and Jack Kennedy were very good friends, and he was very good friends with Joe Kennedy. And he had been to the compound. That was a part of the record. So maybe some vapors I breathed in while I was running. And the other part of it that I didn't fully appreciate until I read Pete Hamill's book on Sinatra, Why Sinatra Matters, that opening line was that your words move me, because that's what he was all about, the magic he brought to singing. Pete Hamill, in his book, Why Sinatra Matters, comparing Bing Crosby and Sinatra, because Bing Crosby was Sinatra's idol. He loved Bing Crosby. I heard him in an interview with Arlene Francis say, I had so many posters, pictures of Bing Crosby in my bedroom. My mother said, if you put one more picture of Crosby on the wall, we're going to throw you out of the house. But he really adored Bing Crosby. But Pete Hamill said the difference between Sinatra and Crosby singing was in Sinatra's singing, he revealed more than he concealed. Bing wasn't emotive. He didn't have, I love you. He didn't have when they wrote that song, Moonlight Becomes You, Johnny Burke and Jimmy Van Heusen wrote Moonlight Becomes You So for Bing Crosby, one of his signature songs. There's a line in the song where he goes, if I say I love you, and they knew him very well. It's difficult for it. But Sinatra revealed, it's 2:45. There's no one in the place. I mean, you feel this guy's heartbreak when he's singing. Right. He was all about revealing emotion and that sort of thing. So I was touched by that, but it was and I also had the great pleasure, Doug, of when I met her and was introduced to her, Nancy Sinatra, his daughter, we talked a little bit, and I have this was at the opening of the Frank Sinatra School of the Arts that Tony and his wife Susan built in Astoria. We had just a little sidebar conversation, Nancy and I said, I know you have 999,999 stories of your father's generosity and his kindness, but I would like to give you the 1 millionth story. And I told her the story just as I told you. And she said, I'd love to put that on the blog, on the family blog. Could you put it into writing? And I said, I'd be honored to. That would be so. Nice. I did, and they did. So
that's fantastic. Well, folks, Dick Golden's American Jazz Show can be heard every Saturday morning between 7 a.m. and 11 a.m. Eastern on the Real Jazz channel on SiriusXM. I should also mention that Dick's show, American Jazz, can be heard at 9 p.m. Pacific time on Sunday night, also on the Real Jazz channel, also on Sirius Radio of SiriusXM Radio. Dick Golden, you are an American treasure. Thank you so
Doug,
very much for being here today.
This has been such an honor. And, right from the beginning, from your email to our conversations on the phone, for me, it's been like speaking with an old friend, an old soul. And, you've been just terrific. And I appreciate your time.
Well, Dick, thank you so very much. Thank you so much. And really do hope that you'll come back too as well. It's really been an honor to have you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.